Welcome to Careers Takeoff, where you learn the latest about how you can get ahead in your career. I'm your host, Conrad Chua. Welcome to this episode of Careers Takeoff. I'm your host, Conrad Chua. Before we get started, I want to remind you to put your questions in the comments field, whether you're watching us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube. You can start by writing down where in the world you're watching this from today. Today, we're talking about the biotech ecosystem. And I think it's no exaggeration that without the vaccines developed by the biotech industry, the world would be in a very bad position today. In just over a year, the industry produced vaccines which helped countries gain control of the COVID pandemic. To help us understand more about the biotech industry, why is it so successful, and can we continue to pay for more innovation, we've got a great panel today. First, we have Aris Oraiopoulos. Aris is a faculty member here at Cambridge Business School and recently co-wrote a book called Breakthrough to Blockbuster. So welcome, Aris.
Thank you, Conrad. Thank you for having us here.
We also have Karl Bergman. Karl is a bioengineer by training, and he dabbled in several industries, several things like consulting in areas like healthcare. And he likes to say that he came to Cambridge where he saw the light, found the way, and he's been CEO of Ellipta, a multi-cancer early screening test company based in Stockholm for the last 5 years. So welcome, Karl.
Hi, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be on the podcast.
So first, Aris, congratulations on your book. One of the things that you wrote about is really how the biotech industry is so much more innovative than Big Pharma. Can you tell us a bit more about the difference between that kind of innovation engine?
Great. So, in general, saying that someone is more innovative than someone else is very hard because there is no objective measure of innovation in other industries. So the study that we did and sort of motivated the book, which we started 5 years ago, was to look at a very objective measure of innovation, which is basically to be granted a priority review status by the FDA. So that's how we define a novel medicine. If you have priority review status, that means basically that if a patient gets sick and if they go to the pharmacy, there is no medicine for your condition. And if you look, at the graph, I don't know if we can see that slide with the green and red colors. What we tracked pretty much for the last 18 years or so, starting from 98 to 2016, but we can talk what happens after 2016 as well. In red, you see that almost consistently in the last 14 years at least, the biotech industry originated. So they filed the application for the FDA as the owners of the molecule for 138 drugs, while the pharma industry collectively originated in 99. So of course, the first reaction when we saw this graph to people is that, yes, you're talking about thousands of small companies versus, a few dozens of big ones. So you would expect the thousands to develop more. But what makes that even more interesting is that they did so at almost 1/3 of the cost. So what you see in the third column, or on the second column of this table, is the total cost spent on R&D over those 18 years, and it's $1.6 trillion for the pharma industry, and it's around less than 700 billion for the biotech industry. So it's collectively as an industry. We don't say something about a specific company or not. And of course, we can talk an hour about this slide, but that's what we meant by more innovative, that collectively the smaller companies have been more innovative than collectively the industry of the largest companies at lower cost.
Karl, what's your reaction when you see this chart and this slide? Does it gel with what you've seen in the
Yeah.
in your experience?
Yeah, for sure. I think they're, seeing it here and seen it before, sort of the general trend here. Many reasons that I can think of from my experience and from dealing with companies in the space, that a startup can inherently take a lot more risk. So you can actually be much more innovative. You can be much more focused, sort of on the thing you need to do, and get it towards market. And there are lots of efficiencies, being a small group, focus group, a knowledgeable group, trying to bring something forward, versus being one part in a very large organization where you're dependent on many departments. We often hear, we're not in the drug space, we're developing diagnostics, but we hear the same kind of thing. Surprise when you hear from others looking at what we do, amazement that we're so few and we are where we are, and we don't expect to be that much larger until we're on the market, maybe 30 people or something like that when we launch. And that's just a testament to being able to collaborate better in a closer group. And the last thing that I'm kind of thinking about is that, when you have a startup, you're dependent on fundraising all the time, and fundraising is difficult. And the investors are fairly, they have fairly stringent criteria. You could think of them as the sort of gatekeepers that you would have in a pharma company, where you need to pass through a certain toll gate, and the toll gates for us is probably the funding rounds, and that kills off a lot of projects that maybe too many, I would argue, but also perhaps ensures efficiency on some level. Some of my thoughts.
And
I know. Yeah, go ahead, Aris. Sorry.
Thanks, Conor. There's an interesting point in the chat that I can see in the comments by Elizabeth, who talks about the process. And that's really important to note, that it is the decision-making process. And that's what we find by, interviewing people, by looking deeper into the data. So as opposed to, it's not that, these smaller companies, they have, let's say, better access to universities, for example. Large companies, of course, they have access to. It's not because they have, better people. There's a lot of turnaround in this industry. People go from small companies to large companies. I would definitely argue that they're all equally smart and capable of, for the science. But there is something about the process that perhaps we can do better to promote these novel drugs.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for that comment. And again, for the audience, if you've got any experience, whether in Big Pharma or in a biotech startup, please feel free to put those in in the comments. Your own insights, or you have any questions for Aris or Karl, please put them in there as well. So thanks very much, Elizabeth. I know, Aris, you've got a framework to think about this sort of gate sort of process. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or later.
Yeah, now is a good time, I think, because Karl mentioned about killing projects, right? And we do think that that's the strength of the biotech ecosystem, that they're very good at killing projects, perhaps too many. They're good at two things. They start too many projects because of their decentralized. So we're not talking about a specific investor, right, or a specific VC fund. Collectively, because there's thousands of investors, they start a lot more opportunities than, the few big companies. And in doing so, of course, they also kill a lot. And I think for everybody that has worked in a large organization, one of the hardest things is to kill an ongoing project. One of the, executives that we interviewed for this work, they said that, well, basically, it requires an act of God to kill an ongoing project, especially if it is, halfway through and so on. So the framework here, in this simple dots diagram, says that precisely because you have many gatekeepers, and again, we're talking collectively about the ecosystem, and you can see the gatekeeper as the gaps in the system, a lot more of those bouncy balls would go through the system. But also these gatekeepers, because they are investors, they will have very stringent requirements about what eventually gets approved. And they're very good at doing this, the so-called in the industry, the killer experiment. So what that means is, yes, you give an idea a chance, but then you try to kill it. You try to kill it once, it survives. You try to kill it again, it survives again. Eventually, that means perhaps there is something. Rather than, supporting an idea and try to keep it alive, you are trying to kill it. It's, the opposite of confirmation bias in a way. Karl, I don't know if you...
Yeah, and it makes me think of another factor that could drive some efficiency here is that while, I mean, the investors can kill it by not funding it in a sense, but the entrepreneurs and the people in the company, like in my case, me and my colleagues, like it's a life and death thing, or sorry, it's not a life and death thing. That's the wrong word, but it's we lose our jobs if we don't succeed. And that kind of driving force you might not have in the pharma company. If you kill the project or sort of you're doing something, you do something else. And that for us, it means we go to long lengths to really find a way to make it work. So you have a harder thing to pass through, but we also spend perhaps much more effort to. I shouldn't speak for pharma companies. I don't want to be. Sound like I don't think they do good work, but saying that we lose our job if we don't pass through the gate will probably make us try a bit extra, perhaps.
There's a comment here by Rosalia, I think, that bureaucracy can be a hinder to innovation, and I think this would really be pertains to that side of large, big pharma organizations and the kinds of decisions that they take, and I guess, Aris, what you're saying is big pharma is that lower half, right, where they don't kill a lot of the duds, and they keep these zombie projects keep going on and drains lots and lots of those sort of resources. Did you and your co-writers look into the kind of bureaucratic processes or the processes within big pharma?
We did, yes. And I think, and again, as Karl was saying, this is not sort of a criticism to, any pharma organization. The point here is that there is an aspect in decentralizing decision-making versus centralized decision-making, which is basically fewer people making decisions. And the problem with large organizations, and I think that's true in any industry, is that you have, this pyramid where very few people make important decisions for the company, as opposed to a more decentralized structure that allows more things to grow and gives more sort of ownership, as Karl was saying before. So, so the process is here, for example, is that once it is about this focus on decision making and the ownership. What as a root cause, it's basically like it goes down to incentives, and often the incentive structures are such that they focus too much on individual performance or the unit performance. Let's say for one specific therapeutic area, for example, let's say within the oncology area, but it doesn't necessarily look across the portfolios. And when it does, it's often not transparent. And it's a hard problem to solve. Like, I don't think, so one thing that I should mention is that often, when we describe this, both the results and our thinking to some executives in large companies, they're not surprised by this. It's not that, they have an aha moment and they fall off, the bubble is bursting. But it's a hard problem to solve, right? And it is, and if anybody from the audience, whether they watch that live or offline, have good ideas, we are actively trying to see what's the right structure and what can you do as the organization grows in size. Actually, it's if you're a small company, it's an easy problem to solve because you have 5, 20, 30 people in the room. But what happens when you have thousands of employees? Like, how do you achieve this balance between coordination and autonomy?
And of course, one way that the industry has been solving it is by sort of acquiring companies at a later and later stage. So they acquire them, before maybe they had a very large R&D, and then gradually they have brought that external to the company via collaboration and partnership and in-licensing, and then stage 1 companies, or sort of phase 1, and then phase 2 and 3 even. So a lot of that. I see a comment here that I think is important as well from Dominic Faito. I think, if I may read it, could we say that finally it's the best presented project marketing financial criteria, which is funded instead of excellent project but not well presented? That's a downside, or the risk here as well, of course, and that I think is, of course, there is some truth to this. I often thought of, also in my previous jobs when I was a consultant and supported investors in various ways, to get funding all the way, you need all the pieces in place. It's unfortunately not just enough with great science most of the time. So if you don't manage to show the value to investors throughout the journey, good projects could be cut. That is sadly probably true. I think there's great innovations that sort of are in the drawers because they didn't find a good home before the patents became too old, and then but that's how it is.
Yeah, and honestly, again, I fully agree with Dominique. And one common, misconception or mistake that often some scientists make, or project managers in general, not just scientists, is that they expect the senior executive to just see the value, of their project and just prioritize their project, but they don't see the perspective of, let's say, of the vice president, where there's a lot of different pitches, even internally within the company, and it's often not so easy to sort of separate the signal from the noise, right? Everything looks like a good idea. Everything might have robust data. So there's some extra work that's required, for the idea to succeed. And often, people, they just assume that people will see it and they know what's good or bad the moment they present it, but it just doesn't happen so easily.
And it's also true that probably the most challenging environment for investors is in the very early stages. That's when the investors need the most, I think, domain expertise, right? Because they will be confronted with sort of not immature, but early stage project where everything, all the value is in the science and the technology and all of that. So they need to be there's a lot of demand on them to understand that environment. And at the same time, they need to span all sorts of fields. When projects are more mature, you can start to look at product development milestones, other people, partners, all these other validation points, and eventually sales, right? So when you're on the market, you can just, is it selling or not? That's relatively easy, and it becomes more of a financial thing. So it's perfectly understandable that it's difficult to get all the good projects get funding, I think.
I guess, Karl, at this point, maybe if we can take this comment, I just wanted to see your reaction to this, where, we've been talking bureaucracy and we assume it's this big pharma that suffers from bureaucracy. But this person on LinkedIn says there's also risk aversion on the VC side, right? So for startups, there's a pipeline of ideas, but he or she feels that VC financing is problematic because they also think, well, are they throwing their money away? What's your response to this part of the equation?
Well, I mean, I think, sort of, are they risk averse? Yes, of course. At the same time, they are the ones taking the risk. It's investing in a private sector startup, a venture, where the statistic will show that even though it's more efficient than biopharma, it's going to be most likely to fail. I mean, the early stage companies are most likely to fail. That's the truth. So they are inherently taking huge risks, and I guess the consequence of that is that they're looking for any way they can reduce the risk. And then the sense everyone else gets is that, they're completely risk averse. But the way I hear it from all the fundraising we've done is they want to understand the risks they're taking. They want the risks to be very well sort of clear and packaged, and that you could take them deliberately. That's how I would phrase it.
Okay. Aris, what's your reaction to this? Is it the case also that maybe from VCs, there's a perception that VCs, they invest in 10 things, 10 projects, right? And they're prepared that six of them will fail. Maybe 2, 3 of them may make some money, and they just want to get that blockbuster, as you mentioned as you title your book. Did you see this sort of risk aversion or better sort of risk appetite from VCs?
I think that's true. There is better risk appetite. But again, it's not, it's not an individual's characteristic, or because, they are more seeking, some kind of thrill at the VC. It's the incentive structure. So let's say if you are VC funded or, a VC partner, then yes, you might fail and you lose some of the investor money. That's the risk. But there's a tremendous upside that you have equity on the upside. So there is a balance between the upside and the downside, the benefit and the risk. Now, often in companies, what happens is, if the project fails, you don't necessarily lose your job, but there is a downside. You might lose the promotion or a bonus or something like that, or something similar, but you don't have a massive upside. The upside might be the bonus, but of course it's not comparable to the upside that you would have as a VC investor. So that's one thing. That again, it's not about the individuals; it's about the incentive structure that makes the risk appetite and the risk tolerance different between the organizations and the VC. And perhaps that's the way it should be. And there's different structures, for different type of investment. But I'm looking at a comment, by Rosalia, about female entrepreneurs. And that's a good segue to the point that VC investors are also biased. So the point here is that no matter whether you are in a big company or a VC investor, you do have your own biases. And actually, there's some research, I can't recall the authors at the moment, that they saw, for example, that probably, yes, that you are less likely for your venture to receive investment if you are a female entrepreneur. But this likelihood actually improves if the VC partners have daughters, which is really interesting finding. That mitigates the bias, right? So you can uncover that the mechanism is not, just coincidence that this happened. There is something going on there with investors that they have, let's say, daughters. But yeah, again, biases are everywhere. That's the one thing that we understand. And what a decentralized system with multiple decision makers allows you to do is to overcome collectively those biases, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's been so unfortunate that, given how few female entrepreneurs there are in most industries, and particularly in biotech, that the most high-profile one, unfortunately, was Elizabeth Holmes and with Theranos, right? So hopefully that doesn't set back the cause of female biotech entrepreneurs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Karl,
and one of our co-authors is, Lisa Drakeman, which is a female entrepreneur and very successful one. And there are definitely some, of course, not as many as we would like to see, but there are examples, and there are increasingly so, I would like to believe.
Karl, do you want to talk a bit about maybe some of the bias, these sort of conceptual biases that you might have seen from investors?
I think I agree that for sure there are, we all have biases, so there's sort of no doubt about that, and no doubt the biases will come in when you make investment decisions, which are very big decisions, and separating yourself from this is, I guess, that's the job, to try and do that objectively in the best possible way. That's the whole point. But inevitably they will exist. It's hard though to say, because it's sort of if I think of it as an experiment. If I go around fundraising, I get a decision, no or yes, or it's no data set that I can make any assumptions on, and whether there are any biases ever. So it's super hard to say. I mean, you need to do research on a higher level to understand this, or to even try to understand it, because it's hard to set up randomized controlled trials around this, right? So it's like that's the challenge.
And Karl, maybe this is a good time to sort of talk a bit about what I think is the DNA of an entrepreneur in the biospace. And I know Aris really went into some detail in his book about the makeup of entrepreneurs, people who in this space who tend to be very deep scientists to begin with, and then trying to make that transition from being a scientist, a research scientist with a great finding, to actually starting and growing a company. Maybe Karl, if we start with you, what's your thoughts about the background of an entrepreneur?
Sure, I think a lot about these topics actually, but I think it's not like there's a one golden bullet here or formula for an entrepreneur. I think it's a matter of what I think matters is getting the right competences in to make the right decisions as early as possible. That's the challenge. That's what it's about. Assuming you have a technology to start with as a spin out from university or something like that. How do you make that happen? And that's very, very hard. And then when you could do, your chances of getting funding, doing the right type of development increases, right? And so how do you do that? So if you're a scientific founder, you have obviously the expertise and the science domain and the technology that you're developing perhaps. And then you have whatever you happen to have based on who you are. Do you have social skills? Maybe you do. Are you good at presenting? Maybe you do. Did you care to broaden your perspectives into finance and business to understand those domains as well? Great. That's very good if you do. And then as much of what you can accumulate, then that allows you to sort of set up a company. But if you lack things, what you can still make it. You just need to make sure you get the team members on board early on and make sure they have incentives to set up the company with you. And I think that's some understand that they can do that, others don't. And there are many ways to success here. That's kind of my point. And I think university can have a huge role to play there in sort of setting up these teams, adding whatever competences is lacking to bring it forward. That's a crucial thing, I think. So in my case, for instance, I'm not the scientific founder of Ellipta. I came in after having, 8-10 years in industry, in strategy consulting and life science, etc., and on the healthcare provision side. And through a friend of mine who I studied with back in time, he introduced me to the scientists behind Ellipta and connected us. Said you should meet. He could see there's going to be a connection here, and I went to meet them and looked through all the science and we discussed what we wanted to do, etc. And it was an easy decision. It took me a week or something to leave my quite good job at that time to join them and setting up the company. And they had that view. They knew they were best at what they were doing, the scientific development, etc. And in any case, they knew it's good to complement with more experiences. So they made that effort to try to find someone to complement the team. And I'm super grateful for that because it's a super exciting journey.
And Aris, I know in your book you devoted, I think, one chapter to this on the bio entrepreneur. Do you want to add on to what Karl said, especially this point about the role that universities and research institutes play, because that's where a lot of those breakthroughs start?
Yes, absolutely. I think often a common misperception about the industry, and the one that I had myself as well, is that if you are some kind of top-notch scientist, you can enter that industry. But that's not necessarily true, because if you think about the drug development process, yes, it starts in a lab, but it's a very long process. It involves, the commercial aspect, involves, marketing. It involves now computer science almost in the entire spectrum of this process. So there's so many talents that one is required, and there is no way, at least I've, being in Cambridge, I've been very lucky to meet some of the, most pioneering people in that industry. But even it's not that you have a mastermind that can see everything, know what's going to work, and they just see the process from end to end. So to Karl's point, perhaps, and I couldn't agree more, that the biggest skill that you need as a CEO or bio entrepreneur is to be able to put those pieces together and find the right person for running the specific trial, for example, the right person for your business development. There's just so many different skills that are required. But it is a fascinating industry. So that, for people that they are considering it, it's definitely one that you should, at least try to see. And then, universities obviously have a huge role, especially our university, because, we are, I think it's safe to say, perhaps the biggest medical campus in Europe, for sure, in terms of, across different metrics. So that we do have a lot of responsibility in educating scientists, educating business people from the science side, and that's definitely happening. But of course, there's always room for improvement.
Okay. I wanted to go on to a big topic, actually, which Aris touched on in his book towards the end, which is great. The biotech industry is churning out innovations, but how are we going to pay for all of this? And Aris, do you want to talk a bit about this slide, which you call pricing a cure?
Yes. So, this is a slide that pictured by Bloomberg, and you can see the website at the bottom. But the point here is, what, as you were saying, Connor, that it is extremely expensive. And when we were discuss this in the last chapter of the book, and when we first said, okay, now that's the final chapter, what should we talk about? I thought we were going to talk about, AI, machine learning, all that cool stuff happening in drug discovery. But what my co-authors, correctly, in hindsight, I realized, pointed out that, yes, the science is there. There's a lot of amazing stuff happening in drug discovery, and the science is there. But you need someone to pay for it. And the biggest question is, like, if you read like the last one, which is in red, because at the time the price was an estimation. Actually, the actual price for this drug for Zolgensma turned out to be $2.1 million. It's an amazing drug, and those are for gene and cell therapy. So it's what they call one and done. So you just do it one and you have a cure for the disease. But it's $2.1 million, right? It's not a trivial amount for our system to cover. Actually, I think the NHS pays for it, but not every country will be able to afford, and the financial side of our healthcare system is also not great. So there is discussion, and we need to think more about the cost, because otherwise, innovation, it's not just us as patients that we're worried about. That's like at the personal level, whether my insurance would cover this. It's also the investors that we were talking earlier. If they don't feel confident that the healthcare system will pay for it, they're not going to invest, no matter how promising the science is. And I think companies like Karl's, they have a lot of promise in terms of bringing those costs down, because a lot of those drugs, are for cancers, and it's just really tough to treat that at the late stage. But if you move earlier and you're able to detect it earlier, the cost dramatically for treatment goes down. And perhaps Karl is, of course, a more appropriate person to talk about that. But I think it's an important point, the pricing aspect.
Yeah, I agree. And there's a term, I think, financial toxicity, if you think of the society level. There are diseases that are dangerous, etc. But it's sad when there are solutions, but you can't afford them, or someone, and there's no one easy to blame here. It's just the fact that many of the therapies are too expensive. And I think what you see here are many of these specialty drugs where you maybe have for rare diseases, etc., but also for cancer therapies, whereas the technologies get much more complex with combination immunotherapies, etc. It could be $300,000 for a treatment, which is a lot. And if people are not insured, or you don't have healthcare system where it's paid for, and even if you do, the costs go somewhere to taxpayers, etc. So it's a huge challenge. And yeah, exactly as you hinted there, yeah, we believe finding the cancer at an early stage, which we're focused on specifically, can help with that, because treatment are often a lot cheaper when you do that. So it's sort of, this is, that one of the reasons for Ellipta to exist is that we want to do just that, enable a test that detects cancer, any cancer really, ultimately. So it is a bit of a moonshot that we're doing here, and that we think we have a great chance of achieving, is one test to catch cancer, a screening test. And if you can do that, you see on the left side here, the different stages of cancer, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and of course the smaller tumors that you might not have symptoms from are in stage 1 or possibly stage 2. And if you do detect them there, the chance of survival is much better. The mortality is a lot lower, right, than if you detect it in stage 4 when it's metastasized to different parts of your body. And the bottom part of that graph is sort of what are the treatment costs. In this case, it's the first year treatment costs as an example, and it's of course much less if you have a small tumor that you might take out with a minor surgery, for instance, and be done. And today we are sort of at a stage where roughly half of the cancers are found in stage 1 and 2. And leaving a lot to later when the prognosis is much worse. And NHS is actually we often showcase the fact that NHS has this strategy. They want to find 75% cancers in stage 1 and 2 by 2028, I think. So they've set this as a goal to try and make this happen. And that's super inspiring to us, because that's what we want to try and help them do.
Yeah, and I think Elizabeth Horsley picked up on your point about the toxicity of the pricing side, right? With a rather notorious person who really bought the patents and just jacked up the treatment prices. So I think everybody is rooting for people like yourselves, Karl, to really drive down those costs for not just for patients, but also for entire countries, because somehow, as you say, ultimately somebody has to pay, whether it's individuals, whether it's taxpayers, and ultimately if you don't have a properly functioning and financed healthcare system, then the economy also suffers. And
the ironic thing here is that I look at things as everything is just a cause and effect sort of. So the obvious reason that we all know, the reason some drugs are super expensive is because there are very few patients that benefit from them. So whoever develops that drug need to go through all the things that we've discussed. They need to get the venture capital, do all of that, etc., and motivate the investments and the risk of failure. And then there has to be a big price tag in the end. So ironic. And that happens in pharma, right? That happens because those negotiations have been ongoing for a long time, and then you get these weird effects with some extremely highly priced drugs. So there's actually a lot of innovation coming forward, and then the challenge is how do we pay for it? But the thing I would like to sort of, the message here is that to the long-term solution, if we agree with this, that early detection is good, then incidentally we actually have to pay for that early detection, because the cost will overall get lower. But we need to pay someone to develop those types of tests. There has to be, and if we think what a blood test costs, it's not $300,000, right? So that's the challenge. Diagnostics has to be, in our view, seen. You have to shift funding from pharma to diagnostics. That's how you lower the total cost of care, in our view. And I'm biased here, of course, but
yeah, but it's a good point, because then people will invest, right? The VCs will then see that people
then the
who are
money
gonna
will come
pay for
in.
this.
Yes,
And then,
exactly.
there's a comment
An
here from
important point here is that
Yeah.
those people that they invest, for example, hedge funds or VCs, they have other options, so they don't have to develop. They haven't dedicated that. They're not like some kind of saints that they say, okay, we're just going to invest all the money of our limited partners to pharma. They can see if tech offers highest returns, they would move to tech.
Yes.
So the reason that they invest, they are investors driven by financial performance, right? So those are the sort of the VC, investors of the side. And if they, again, the point here is if they don't see the returns, the money will just move to other areas, and that's going to hurt the entire value chain of the pharma industry. And although, of course, the example mentioned was by Elizabeth, about the pharma bro, is a terrible example, and we should still point out that this is an outlier. And often, when we see the prices of drug going up, the supply chain is not just, the pharma companies at the end. Often it's the middle people in the value chain that drive us. And, we can provide the reference about that. It's not, a personal opinion, but it's not as simple that some executive like Martin Shkreli will just, increase the price. Most companies, at least, they don't just do just that, right?
No, I agree.
Maybe if we just, since we're on the thing about pricing, if we take this question from Selena, who says, as therapeutical costs are steadily increasing, especially in the US, is it? I think she's actually meaning that there's raising that threshold for cost effectiveness is being discussed. Any reactions to this?
Yeah, I know this is going on for sure. It's always a discussion, and I guess UK has been a front runner here for a long time with NICE, and I think that's coming to the US as well in different ways. It's hard to say anything conclusive, but for sure it's ongoing with the current administration in the US. That's my understanding.
Okay.
A huge concern for everybody in the value chain, even for very early stage companies.
Yeah.
And then if we just take one last sort of question, I think this is from Rosalia, and this goes back to something we talked a bit earlier on, where she talks about these government-led initiatives. And of course, a lot of the biotech breakthroughs come from universities, public-funded research institutes. Do either of you know of initiatives that made it easier for entrepreneurs that support entrepreneurs in the biotech side from a, say, public sector point of view?
Do you want to go first, or?
Absolutely. The starting points of all of these discoveries are the universities. So the universities are the one, perhaps, that they will identify some kind of potential target, and then this, either the biotech or the pharma companies will read the paper, often published, the vast majority of the time published by faculty in the medical or biological department, and that's how they will start the research. They play a very complementary and symbiotic role. But the public funding, and I can't recall the exact numbers of the spending by the NIH, the National Institute for Health in the US, how much it has contributed to patents. There are studies that have shown they've been directly linked this money to breakthrough discoveries. But everything starts from, at the university level, obviously, private companies also fund studies in universities, but the starting point is the university for this research.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of to get entrepreneurs to become even more sort of experimental and creative. I think it's grants can obviously fill a role. There are plenty of grants to that's a way for a company that maybe has to focus on its core project all the time and just leave everything aside. But if you can have access to funding to do some more things, that could bring out innovation that otherwise wouldn't have happened.
Thanks very much. We've reached the end of our episode today. It's been a great pleasure speaking to you, Aris, and to Karl. Thank you also to our audience. Love to hear your feedback on how we're doing. So if you've got any comments about how we're using these live streams, how we can build that strong learning community, please pop them in the comments. I'll go over after the show is over. Our next episode is in 2 weeks' time, and it's going to look at a different kind of wellness. It's about how the world of yoga, and how did something that was very much counterculture in the 1970s, where you think you've got long-haired ascetics, how did that conquer the world? And I myself was a skeptic and several years ago, and now I practice yoga 20 minutes every morning. So learn about how the yoga movement marketed itself to people like me, and maybe there'll be lessons for other movements like climate change. I'll be joined by two of our academics here at Cambridge Business School, Shaz Ansari and Kamal Munir, and they co-wrote a paper with Deborah Brown precisely about how yoga conquered the world. So join me on 13th of May with 12:45 to 1:30 UK time, right? To find out, well, how did all this happen? So other than that, it gives me great pleasure to thank once again Aris and Karl for joining us. Wish you all the best, and wish you all the best to our audience as well. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for having us, Conrad.
Thank you so much.